who is not here. Now, again, today, since we're talking about the human person, this is an interesting question for Christians for a few different reasons. One of the kind of main reasons it's going to be interesting for Christians is that we have a hard time sometimes recognizing what does it truly mean to be human? What makes us us, in a sense? And you've probably heard something along the lines of, well, let me put this. I'm trying to like ask a question in a way that we can just chat about it, or someone can unmute. How many of you have heard, and you can just kind of throw in to the chat, how many of you have ever heard, or which one do you hear more often? Do you hear that you are a body soul, or that you are body, soul, and spirit? How many of you have ever kind of like seen that? And if you have, which one do you kind of hear the most from church? Body and soul, or body, soul, and spirit? Oh, body and spirit, right? That might be just even different. So it seems like for a lot of you, body, soul, and spirit is kind of the way that, you know, maybe in church that we've heard about the body, or we've heard about the human person. And at times this can be okay. At times when we're having that conversation, we might be actually thinking, okay, cool, there's a verse in the Bible that kind of maybe gives an inclination of body, soul, and spirit. But we don't know what this actually means for us. And this can cause a lot of problems in the way that we think about people, and we think about what our body is and what the flesh is. So if you have those notes, let's go ahead and kind of jump into the notes. And I'm going to try and present here to make it a little bit easier, a little slideshow. It's going to kind of go in and out. So give me, you know, a minute to make sure it's working. Just to kind of help us stay together. Okay, now I think doing it this way, and let me know, because this is also new for me. Can you see both me and the PowerPoint? Cool. Ben says no, but Darian says yes. Some people are saying kind of both. If you're on a computer, you can probably see both. If you're on a phone, okay, Ben says he's on a computer and he can't. You should be able to. I don't know if you need to make your screen bigger. That might actually be kind of a thing, because even in the recording, it shows both. So try to see if you can like play around with the screen size and see if that'll make it any better as well. Because I know I can click into the presentation and you can see me, but I'm going to try and have both at the same time. All right. Ben, you still can't see both. Let me try and refresh it. I'll try to jump back in and out for those who are having a hard time seeing both, so that way it doesn't just look like you're staring at a PowerPoint the entire time, because that would be boring. Okay, so let's go ahead and grab those notes. The first thing that we're going to talk about is what is called a dichotomy. And a dichotomy is a way in which people perceive the body, the human person, as simply a body and soul. So when you hear that kind of phrase, body and soul, we're talking about more of a dichotomy. And what the dichotomy is really dealing with is often that there is the flesh of the human person, there is just a body, but then there's other element that makes people people. And and this is an okay kind of thing, except for when we've split them apart so distinctly. And so what happens is the dichotomous view of human nature distinguishes primarily between the body and soul, but it distinguishes often between the material, the physical world, and the immaterial and the spiritual world. The problem with kind of trying to distinguish between the two so clearly is, how do we define what the spiritual world is versus the physical world? So one kind of common way of thinking about this is, if someone is dealing with, a mental health issue by any means, um, is it simply the body messing up, causing the mind to mess up? Is your flesh causing your Eduardo just said that he can see both now. You can go to the people tab, and there are two Aaron Rosses, and one shows the presentation and the other shows the video chat. So if you kind of want to bounce back and forth to make it to where you're not just seeing a PowerPoint, but you want to get the spelling right, you can do that. So the hard part is, when you actually think about how the two meld together, in what ways are they actually interacting? If someone who is dealing with depression, and the depression is a physical kind of, there is something going on in the brain that is causing the depression, in what way does the physical and the soul, the body and the soul, what way do they actually connect or work together? The problem is, in the Bible, spirit and soul are used interchangeably, but there doesn't really seem to be too clear of a distinction between body and soul. Some of us might kind of point out and think about Paul, and how Paul talks very often about this idea of the flesh. And Paul mentions this reality that there is a problem of the flesh, or there's the sin of the flesh. And sometimes what we do is we read Paul and we now kind of demonize or villainize our bodies. We think that our soul is here, our soul is good, and our bodies are bad. Our souls are the proper thing, and our bodies are the wrong thing. This kind of harkens back to one of our heresies that we've mentioned before, and that heresy is Gnosticism. So if you remember Gnosticism, Gnosticism is that thing that we talked about that said a few different things. When we talked about creation, Gnostics actually believed that God did not create everything. If you remember this discussion, God didn't create everything. God created all the immaterial stuff. Or sorry, this other thing called the demiurge created all this immaterial stuff. And when he created it, he made it all bad. And then God just had to come back by and take all the bad stuff and put it together. And then he created the world. And so God gave us our unseen stuff, such as our soul, and he was just dealt a bad hand with all of the seen stuff, such as the created world. Thus, the soul was good and the body was bad. Sometimes we read Paul and we have that same perception, that when Paul keeps talking about the sins and the desires of the flesh, Paul is actually talking about our body, that our body is inherently bad, our body is inherently evil or sinful, and our soul is the thing that's good that just needs to be saved. Our soul is good and our body is bad. The problem that we get with this kind of Gnostic sense of, and you can kind of, you can write this down. I'll see if I can actually throw it into the screen or throw it into the PowerPoint as we're talking. Maybe it'll let me. It's called a body-soul dualism, or sometimes hierarchical dualism. Let me make sure that's spelled right here. Okay, this is all new for me. So bear with me as I'm trying to type to you so you can see things and follow along. Okay, so body-soul dualism or hierarchical dualism. And so what a body-soul dualism or a hierarchical dualism does is it says that our bodies are bad, our souls are good, and the thing that just needs to happen is that we just need to get our soul away from our body. Like once we have fixed the problem is just the flesh, is this body, this thing that we've been given. And what Jesus does is he doesn't fix this. Jesus provides us a way for our soul, whatever that soul might be, to be ripped away from the body and to be kind of taken up into heaven, and then we'll be okay. Sometimes I think we have this perception because when we think about heaven and we think about the future, we think about this kind of like disembodied soul. We think about our soul as being separate from our body, and our soul is saved and we can kind of shed our body. This has turned into a thing that we've actually seen, especially more in the 90s. There was a bunch of cults that kind of came up around this idea. How many of you have ever heard of that cult where people thought that they were going to actually be whisked away on Halley's Comet when it kind of came by in the 90s? A lot of you are probably way too young, but have you ever heard of this kind of Halley's Comet cult? Anyone? If you have, maybe just shoot a chat. Ben says he's heard of it. Anyone else heard of, there's a specific name for the cult, but they had this perception. It was called Heaven's Gate. So if you're ever interested, you can kind of look up Heaven's Gate and kind of get some more information. But Heaven's Gate had this idea that the cult leader basically said, hey, here's the way to get into heaven. When you get into heaven, it's that your soul has to get there and you have to leave your body behind. And basically, as odd as this is, you are going to actually hitch a ride, so to speak, on Halley's Comet. In order to hitch this ride, you have to shed your body, or another way to put it is commit suicide. So this Heaven's Gate cult all kind of committed a kind of mass suicide together. I think it was in the teens or 20s amount of people that did it. And they all kind of took some poison. They were all oddly wearing Nikes, if I'm remembering the cult correctly, which is just kind of odd. Why were you wearing Nikes? They thought that was the shoe to wear, I guess. But they all thought that if they could just rip their soul from their body and kind of attach to Halley's Comet, they'd be whisked away to this cult version of heaven that they had in their mind. We think that's kind of like, we think that's odd, right? However, Christians sometimes have a similar perception, though our perception might be a bit more muted. Again, and I say this with all like, that's the right word here. I say it with all like, no one's judging anyone. No one is saying, how dare you? But if you remember, and I also say this to say that if you have any kind of issue with depression, please go see the school counselor. It's free. Go speak with someone, get help. It's really important. But I say that to say this. How many of you remember this pastor who kind of made the news last year for committing suicide shortly after kind of speaking? It was in a church in California. Does anyone remember this? A few people remember. I wish I could remember his name. I unfortunately can't remember his name. But if you paid attention to his wife's Instagram, shortly after this happened, she made this comment, and I use this because it's a very kind of like more recent event, but she made this comment where she said, kind of talking to her kind of husband who had died in the comment, had said, "You are now finally free. You've been freed. You don't have to suffer this any longer." That is a body-soul dualism, or a hierarchical dualism, kind of played out in real time for us. Because what she's basically saying is, you finally gotten rid of the part of you that was the bad part, and now you can just live in the good part. Now that your soul has kind of been removed from your body, you can finally be free of this thing that was always keeping you down. It is a hierarchical dualism that actually kind of promotes this idea that when God, thank you, Eduardo, Jared Wilson was his name, right? It promotes this idea that the body is just something we need to get rid of. It's the problem. If we can just get rid of it, we'll be okay. The really scary thing about her comment, and I say this with all grace, meaning like I couldn't imagine if that was my wife and what I would say in the time. So it's not like she is theologically processing or philosophically processing her husband's suicide and trying to make sure her words were proper. I can understand someone not doing that, right? It's no shame or blame on her. But it is the kind of sense that we maybe as pastors have kind of given to our congregations. Let's get your soul fixed. And we can worry about the body later, but the main part is the soul. And so we've got to kind of maybe move away from a hierarchical dualism, because it creates these kind of problems. The problem for some Christians, like I asked you at the beginning of class, is that we move from a dichotomy to a trichotomy. So if you have that, kind of your next blank there is the trichotomy, where rather than trying to figure out how the two kind of go hand in hand, we kind of split them up even farther. We distinguish between a body, a soul, and a spirit, to which the body is going to refer to material dimensions. The body is going to refer to our flesh. The soul is going to refer to the immaterial part of the human life that is natural, so such as our mind. So in some sense, we have a body, we have a soul, often kind of called our mind, the way that we think, how we have a will, how we kind of make decisions. And then we have the spirit, which is apart from the soul, and in some sense is our spiritual being. It's not quite so much what makes our decisions. The two kind of go hand in hand, but they are distinct. And what's being saved isn't the body or the soul, but what's being saved is the spirit. So again, we've almost split it out even further. We kind of get over the problem of how does the body and the mind work together. We don't really have that issue anymore, because now we've split them up into three. So sure, the body and the soul can interact. Sure, there can be a problem with the body that has a problem with the soul. So if your brain is malfunctioning, it's causing your soul or your mind to be depressed. And so those two can kind of go back and forth. But then there's this kind of third part, that there's the spirit that is distinct and kind of set apart from the other two. It allows for a complex understanding of humanity, but it's not really found within the biblical text. There's one part in the Bible that actually talks about body, soul, and spirit, or maybe body, mind, and spirit. But that's about it. The rest of the Old Testament, and probably most of the New Testament, really kind of works within a dichotomy. In some sense, a two working together, some kind of body-soul dualism that is not hierarchical. The next kind of view of human life is going to be plurality, which is going to actually almost say that there is a huge swath of dimensions of the person's life. So it can't just be so quickly boiled down to a body and soul. That actually there's so many elements to the human person. There's our psychological, our sociological, our political, our economic. All of these are dimensions of human life. And yet, as Christians, we take that plurality and we say that through that plurality, there's unity, meaning that Scripture doesn't actually say there's any sense in which my political life is distinct from my sociological life, or that my economic life is distinct from my spiritual life. The Scripture is constantly kind of pushing us towards the reality that all of these things are constant and working together. We do this as both a person, but also a person in community. That my economic life affects the economic lives of other people. If you know Ray Allen here on campus, this kind of plays effect into the way that we actually think about our economic life, in the sense that in our economic life, I mean, we all have kind of grown up in America with this idea of the American dream, right? Like, let's have a 2-car garage and a white picket fence. Maybe that's kind of like the 50s version of it, right? Like 3 perfect kids and a dog and a big backyard and good jobs, and we'll be happy. We have this kind of American dream. But as Ray Allen would say, very often our American dream usually comes at the expense of someone else's American dream. When I am buying up clothes, and that those clothes kind of can help represent me, and I'm buying the clothes that I like to buy, and they help represent my American dream because I've got the money to buy those clothes. Oftentimes we don't see how that might affect someone else, like the sweatshop who has underpaid workers, people who are just trying to survive, who are making the clothes that play into our American dream. And so while our American dream is being kind of fulfilled, our economic dreams are being fulfilled, it's actually at the detriment to someone else's economic life. And so for Christians, we actually hold to this perception that if we're really going to be thinking about what it means to be a whole human person, we have to recognize that all of these complex parts to the person, our psychological well-being, our sociological well-being, our economic well-being, all of these play a part together in community. So my psychological life, if I'm unhealthy, I'm going to take my unhealthiness and put my unhealthiness onto other people. If politically I am not able to engage well with others, and I politically am constant in fighting with others and not being congenial or civil in my political life is actually creating disunity, not unity. My ideas are actually causing the suffering of others. So as Christians, what we do is we try to actually take this plurality and unity. How do each part of the human person work together? Now, again, as I told you, for the most part, Christians throughout kind of like theological history, Michael asked a great question. Give me 1 second, Michael, right? Just to kind of reiterate, the primary kind of theological and philosophical position that has been kind of the most orthodox position in the church is a kind of body-soul dualism, but it is not a dualism that is separate, but rather a unified reality, that there is no hierarchy between the body and the soul. This becomes really important in salvation, because salvation isn't about saving one or the other. Salvation is what God does to actually redeem both all the time. And if there's a hierarchy that says salvation is only about saving the soul, then the body gets left away. And in inverse, if people think about salvation as simply God's going to fix my body, we can often kind of forget about the spiritual life and about what the soul is supposed to be for. So we talk about having a unity between the two. Now, Michael asked a good question. Michael asked for the class, he said, so plurality is what we're supposed to be shooting towards. I don't want to say that plurality in terms of, remember, we're not talking about plurality in terms of having kind of siloed off parts of our life, right? We're talking about that what makes up the human person is all of these different parts, all of our psychological life, our sociological life, our political life, so on and so forth. But as Christians, what we shoot for is to find the way in which all of those parts of life are unified. Does that make sense, Michael? We want to actually kind of find the ways in which all of these things actually should work together versus kind of being distinct parts from each other. So my spiritual life, my life with God is in essence a part of my sociological life in how I engage with other people, and vice versa. My sociological life plays effect and a part into my spiritual life. Thus, as Christians, we do this thing called church, because we actually think that the community of the people of God coming together is good for us as individuals. Michael, does that help answer that question? Or does anyone else have questions about kind of these kind of two main ideas, dichotomy and trichotomy, and then kind of what plurality and unity should look like for Christians' life? Ben said this, so can we view ourselves to have a dichotomous view, yet also having plurality at the same time? Yeah, of course we can. That's a great question. In a sense, Ben, when we talk about plurality, we're talking about all the different areas of the human life that make up the human person. When we talk about dichotomy, or we talk about kind of a dualism or a tritheism, not tritheism, but a triism, like we're talking about what makes up, when we talk about plurality, what makes up that dualism. It is all of these different parts, and they're all are intertwined. When we think back to creation, and if we use creation as an example, when God created Adam and Eve, there was no need to talk about kind of the two distinct spheres of the person, body and soul. When God created Adam and Eve, God created them and he breathed his life into them. And it was already assumed that they were this thing together. However, when we look at the created order, we actually see how God had kind of set out this kind of path for, here is how you all work together, right? For instance, Adam had this very kind of specific task in how Adam was supposed to kind of engage with creation, naming creation, being with creation. Eve is created as a helpmate to Adam, meaning that Adam wasn't this distinct one thing by himself, but now Adam was actually made for this community, made to actually have a helpmate, to be doing this together. And God even kind of says other things, and such as like they were given all of the plants to eat, but not the animals, right? God actually says, any of the plants, anything that grows on the trees, anything that kind of grows on the ground, it's yours to eat, all except for this fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So God already set out to some degree, here is who you are in a created thing that I've given life. I've given this soul, I've breathed my life into. But here is how you work in community in terms of kind of the plurality of your life. Here's how you engage sociologically in terms of kind of you and animal kind, or you and trees, or you and now Eve. And we can talk about economic there, but that's a long discussion we don't need to get into today. So yes, we can, and we do as Christians think of ourselves within a kind of body soul dualism that's non-hierarchical, meaning that one isn't greater than the other, because we might be kind of inclined to start thinking about the soul as more important than the body. Um, but we also have to recognize that human life is done through a idea of plurality, in terms of there's a lot of things that make us up, not just this idea of I have a soul and I just need to fix the soul. Actually, we're in community in terms of being in community as psychologically and sociologically. Um, does that make sense for everyone? Are we kind of on the same page? This is going to be an odd request. Here's my request, just to kind of make sure like we're all kind of working together and kind of doing this thing. Everyone type in marshmallow in the chat. I know it's dumb, but helps me kind of like say, hey, we're all here together. We're all working. I also like to see that there are some people that spell it marshmallow and marshmallow, you know, and I'd just like to say that that's some way that people talk differently. It's the whole classic, caramel or caramel, marshmallow or marshmallow. All right, let's kind of jump to our next section, which we're going to talk more about the human soul specifically. So the human soul, kind of what we think the human soul is it's the essential life or self of a person. So for Christians, the soul is that thing that kind of makes the essential life. Some people kind of compare the soul with the mind, and the mind and brain are different things. When we talk about the brain, we're talking about the actual physical thing by which things kind of compute, through which electric signals are being sent, and by which I'm talking and breathing and all of that. When we talk about the mind, we talk about actually the decision kind of making person, the person who has this consciousness, the person who asks, to some degrees, the existential questions of life. Who am I? What makes me me? Why would I want to do these things? This is what we often talk about as the soul. The key is here, and this is a really important distinction, is that we don't have a soul, but we are a soul. Sometimes Christians kind of have this perception that we own this thing, like this kind of thing as a soul. Like, I have a soul, you have a soul, that's fine. But in some sense, actually, what it is that we are the soul. Therefore, if we are the soul, then the soul is going to include material and physical aspects of life, as well as the spiritual dimension. Meaning that our soul, who we are as people, again, it goes back to this unity thing. We're not so distinct that one can be kind of ripped away from the other. That they're so unified that when we actually say that we are a soul, we're recognizing that all of me, while there might be a physical and a spiritual element to me, I am all in this kind of one thing. If this is kind of given credence to us in the person of Jesus. When we think about the person of Jesus being fully God and fully man, we don't think about Jesus as being man, like we talked about in our heresies, man who assumes a place of being God, or we think about God as just pretending to be humanity. When we think about the person of Jesus, and we actually say this kind of what we call the hypostatic union of Jesus that we've talked about before, between being fully God and fully man, it's that Jesus is both, and indistinguishably so. We don't do like one of our kind of heretical church fathers kind of said, we don't try to find the places in which we look for the human Jesus versus the divine Jesus. We recognize that Jesus as Jesus is always and forever both and at the same time. And that goes for us in terms of our soul. When we think about kind of soul and body, that the soul is it's not something that we own. It's not something that's trapped inside of our body, but rather the soul is what makes up all of the material and physical aspect of life. This is what we would call, and you'll need to make sure that you kind of keep this, a holistic view of the soul. because the holistic view is reinforced by biblical expectations of the resurrection of people's bodies. This becomes important if you're thinking like, okay, this is kind of philosophical and heady, and this is kind of a lot. Actually, the holistic view really, or how we view the body and soul, is how we view salvation. Even though this class isn't going to get into salvation per se, how we think about salvation is determined by how we think that the soul works for the person. And so if we take a holistic view that actually says what constitutes the human person is the body and soul in this unity together in a non kind of distinct, we can't tear them apart. When we talk about salvation, it's not just the spirit, the spiritual side of me, this thing that we often think as the immaterial living forever thing. This isn't just being saved, but actually all of me, the material, is being saved as well. This is what makes us different from Gnostics, because the Gnostics, again, said, well, what's being saved is your soul, this thing that can be ripped out or torn out of the material world, because the material world is bad and the spiritual world is good. As Christians, what we think about is that actually, no, these are both being saved, and this is perfectly represented in the resurrection of Christ. When Jesus is resurrected, one of the things that Jesus was kind of particular to do in the resurrection is go and see the apostles in his physical self, as his physical body. If we remember the story of doubting Thomas isn't so much doubting the Jesus that he sees in front of him in terms of like, is this a premonition? Is this a ghost? Is this just some kind of, thing about Jesus? What Thomas is kind of doubting in so many ways is this the physical resurrection of Christ? Is this Christ in body? Or is this Jesus as some kind of like perception? This is why Jesus might look at doubting Thomas, who we call doubting Thomas, and say, here, look at the holes in my hands, touch the hole in my side, see that it is me in the flesh. Or why Jesus, even after his resurrection, talks about having meals with people, with the apostles, with the two on the road to Emmaus, that Jesus is eating with them because the physical part of Jesus is being resurrected. If this is what happens to Jesus, it is the Christian faith to say, it's why we do baptism. Because in baptism, we're not just pronouncing death to self and kind of being born into new life in terms of a Christian life. We're also pronouncing that death is going to happen and resurrection will happen for all people as well. It's more than just some proclamation of I'm a Christian. It's also proclamation of what Christ has done and what Christ is going to do. In salvation, we are both being saved as soul and body. This is why, again, the New Testament cares more about being raised back from the dead than it does care about going to heaven. There's many more mentions in the New Testament about resurrection from the dead, or being raised back to life with Christ, or of different kind of ways that it's expressed. There's many more points in which that is the important aspect for the New Testament church than going to heaven. There's very little talk about going to heaven, and there's a ton of talk about being raised back to life with Christ. Again, even Revelation starts with this very thing, that when John is having this kind of vision, John is talking about Jesus, who is the firstborn among the dead. You cannot have a firstborn if there's not going to be more. Otherwise, Jesus would be the only born among the dead. He'd be the only one to ever do it. But the New Testament church didn't think he was the only one to do it. If God did it for Jesus and we follow after Christ, God's going to do it for us as well. This is the beautiful part. And so when we take the holistic view, we're actually saying when we're saved, it's not just that I'm being saved in terms of this kind of spirit element or my consciousness, but actually all of creation, all of the world is kind of moving towards this idea of being redeemed by God, especially the physical element. So, any questions on kind of body, soul, dualism, anything there before we move to an interesting kind of idea of the origin of the soul? Okay, so Morgan says, is there, sorry, it went away. Is there a difference between spirit and soul? Then what exactly about us are being saved? Okay, so again, when we talked at the beginning of the lecture, we said that there's kind of common views. There's the dichotomy view and there's the trichotomy view. And the dichotomy view is the primary kind of position of the church for a long time. And for the most part, the thing that we actually see in scripture, in that there is no difference between spirit and soul. That spirit and soul are actually kind of referring to the same thing. That there is no kind of like trichotomic view. There is no body, soul, and spirit. It really is body and soul. And often soul and spirit are used as interchangeable words within the Bible to refer to the same aspect of the person. So what exactly is being saved? Well, if spirit and soul are kind of the same or interchangeable in the dichotomy view, or maybe a holistic view, then it is being saved, but so is the body kind of being redeemed for life eternal. Both are being saved at the same time. When Paul mentions flesh, to kind of go back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the lecture, when Paul mentions flesh, Paul isn't talking about the flesh of our bodies as being bad. Paul is using this sarx, this idea of flesh in the Bible. He's using, or this New Testament, he's using this as kind of the sinful reality by which we partake in. He's not talking about your body as a sinful thing as much as there is this thing of sin that we actually engage with. This is pretty distinct for Paul because Paul does not want to talk about, or Paul does not talk about the body as being evil. It's not. Paul is fighting a Gnostic view about the body that says the body is evil, we need to get away from it. But what he's talking about is that we as the person, both body and soul, we have this desire to partake in the sins of the flesh, which for flesh for Paul wasn't, again, our body, but it was this idea of sinfulness, this idea of partaking in anything that is not of God. That's what Paul uses when he talks about flesh. And he talks about the sins of the flesh. So when we're being saved, we are talking about salvation as I am being saved completely, body and soul. And that while the soul might actually kind of partake in that salvation immediately, the body is also being redeemed to a point and to a place of being raised back to life with Christ. That there's some kind of final element of redemption and salvation, which is called resurrection in our life. Does that make sense, Morgan? Does anyone else have any questions before we move to like, where does the soul come from? Awesome. Okay. Hey, I want to do something different. Ben, that you asked a question. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, because I don't want to just sit here and talk. I want to hear from you guys as well. So do me a favor and unmute yourself and ask your question. It's good that you typed it up, so that way in the recording, we have that question. But go ahead and ask your question for me now.
Okay, so my question is exactly in the book of Matthew when Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's talking to the disciples and such. what does he mean then when he's talking about the spirit is willing then but your flesh is weak?
Yeah, that's a good question. Funny enough, I just preached on that passage on Sunday, although I didn't talk necessarily much about that kind of difference. So we need to keep that in context with the rest of it, which is watch and pray that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Now, in Luke adds something that's kind of interesting in his garden thing that maybe helps us kind of understand a bit more what's happening. In Luke, when the apostles fall asleep, it says that they fall asleep in their great sorrow, or they fall asleep in sorrow. This is an interesting phrase. What's happening, and Luke does, if you're in hermeneutics, or if you've taken hermeneutics, Luke uses an inclusio to help us understand this a bit more than Matthew does, because Matthew's being written very much to a Jewish audience, which would have already understood it. But the inclusio that Luke is using is that phrase, pray that you won't fall into temptation. And what is the temptation that Luke is talking about? The temptation is, and it's the same temptation that Jesus is talking about in Matthew. It's the temptation to choose our own way, our own self, over the way of God. This is the same temptation that's happening. Oh, no, yeah, you can grab it. Thank you. The temptation is kind of that same thing, that it's almost the same exact temptation that we actually find in Genesis. What is Adam and Eve's problem? That Adam and Eve choose themselves over God. We actually see this play out in the garden, because right after this kind of prayer moment in the garden, the Pharisees and Sadducees, they've come to arrest Jesus, and we have different accounts in different gospels of what the apostles do. One apostle decides that what he's going to do is take out his sword and try to kill one of the people who are arresting Jesus. And he's a terrible swordsman and ends up hacking off an ear rather than killing a person. You got to be pretty bad to actually go to kill somebody with the sword and somehow accidentally just cut the ear off. And Jesus kind of does this thing where Jesus is like, no more of this, right? Like, that's why in our accounts, Jesus, in at least one of our accounts, Jesus picks up the ear and he puts it back on and says, no more of this. This is the flesh. That is choosing a way that's not of God. In another account, one of our apostles gets so scared for their own life that they start to run away, and someone grabs that apostle by the cloak and pulls the cloak off, and the apostle runs away naked, as the Bible tells us, right? This, again, for Jesus, is choosing the way of the flesh, to not choosing the way of God, in which, what is Jesus' prayer? If it can be taken from me, please do. But if not, nevertheless, it's your will and not my will, right? In so many ways, the flesh there is kind of being interacted with when we choose ourself over the way of God. Does that make sense, Ben? Cool. Ben says yes. All right, let's talk about where the origin of the soul comes from, because this is going to be important, especially when it relates to even something like abortion. You know, how we think about the origin of the soul is going to kind of engage with the way that we talk about, as Christians, saying abortion is wrong. So when we ask, where does the soul come from, or where's the origin of the soul, the first perspective is the creationist perspective, which says that every person born constitutes a genuinely new person, meaning a new soul, and that God is the creator of each soul. So the soul is this kind of thing that is made or created at the moment of birth. Now, or the moment of, depending on where you kind of put it, the moment of inception. The creationist view, there are two kind of main views that people hold to. And they both, again, have their implication. One view is that at the time of God creating in Genesis, there were 6 days. If we remember our discussion on creation, we said that in kind of our young Earth creationist view, God stops creating. Day 6, he's done. If God stops creating, then God must have created all of the souls that would ever need to be before he rested on day 7, which is kind of an odd thought. But for a creationist kind of view of a creationism that kind of allows for God or thinks about the fact that God is still creating, that the soul is created for at the moment or at the time of whether it's birth or inception. Now, the question for a lot of Christians becomes, does that happen at birth or does it happen at inception? Or does it happen at a heartbeat? Does it happen? When does it happen that God puts this soul into the person that God creates? It becomes blurry at best because the Bible doesn't really say, here is when God creates the soul. It's one of the struggles for Christians who are trying to talk about abortion and tried to talk about abortion being a sin. It's one of the struggles that the Christians deal with. Where and when is the soul created? Who's to say, for a lot of people in this line of thinking, not me, but who's to say that God doesn't put the soul in the child as soon as the child is born? Or who's to say that the soul isn't put in at heartbeat? Or who's to say that the soul is put in at the time of inception? This is why the argument for abortion has always been based on, for a lot of the church, inception, right? Or conception, sorry, not inception like the movie. It's early for me too. Conception. Because if we say it's at conception, then we can say from any point of the child's life, it's murder because we're killing the child because the child has a soul. This only works in a holistic view of the person, in a holistic view that actually says the body is a good thing, that the body is not evil itself, that the body engages with the desires of the flesh, but the body itself is good. It's created by God. It's a good thing. The next one is Traducianism, which is a very interesting thought. It actually overcomes some of the problem of abortion because it actually asserts that the child's soul comes from the parent's soul, meaning that the parents aid in the creation of the soul alongside of God. And some people also call this generationalism. This overcomes maybe a problem of abortion, actually, because the soul is kind of passed down from the parents. So there's no need to ask, when does God actually put the soul inside of this child, inside of this life? Because it must come from the two parents. And that happens, of course, at the time that a child is conceived, no later than that. Most Christians do not hold to this idea. This is a very limited view, and it's not widely accepted. But the creationist kind of idea of the soul is one that is the most kind of orthodox view of the church, because it has to hold this reality that people, we as people, do not ourselves create. We cannot create a soul. Only God can do that. So here's going to be the real question, and I want to try and discuss this as a class a little bit. So how do you think about, and you can unmute yourself. Well, here's what I'll actually do. Let's do it this way. I'm going to ask this question. I just want you to kind of put in the discussion board me, and then I'll call your name, and then you can speak. That way we can kind of make sure that people aren't talking over each other. I wish there was almost like a raising hand emoji in the discussion board. If you find that, then wonderful, good for you. If not, just type in something to let me know that you have something to say, and I'll call on you, and you can unmute yourself and go from there. But when does life begin? In your tradition, in your thought, in your perspective, and trying to understand where the soul comes from, where does life begin? Any thoughts? Are people as just afraid to talk on Google Meet as they are in class? Let me ask this. Do you see why it's important to think about when the soul begins? Or I can ask even a different question. As a pastor, as someone who's going to go into the ministry, what do you do when someone comes to you in your congregation and says, I'm thinking about having an abortion? Help me process whether or not this fetus in me is a child, has a life, has a soul, or if it's just a blob of cells um, going through a process. How do you talk to them? Macy says it makes the topic more complex. What do you mean by that, Macy? If you want to go ahead and yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so I just feel like it's not just, I don't know, it makes everything way more serious and there's more like weight and it's more difficult for us to like grasp that. Like, because we don't know when that like the soul is. And so I just feel like that makes it way harder for us to understand or explain that to other people.
Yeah, it definitely is going to make it a little bit harder. That's true. We're hoping that it makes it a bit more, that gives us a bit weightier of a discussion, right? Because at the same time, while it does make it a bit more complex, hopefully when someone's trying to process this question, if we just tell them, the soul starts from conception, how can we actually prove that? How do we actually talk about it? Does the person just accept it because like we're the pastor and we go, uh-huh. Amy, go ahead, Amy.
Yeah, no, I think sorry, don't mind my voice, I've been sick, but you asked sort of like, well, what did we grow up with? And for me, it's very much so been that holistic view of they were kind of the same. So that moment of conception is kind of when life begins. So I think when you're approaching that as a pastor, I don't know, for me it's like what I've always heard was just, if you're contemplating that, like you are taking a life. But I think that idea of like the separation, like Macy was saying, it makes it more complex. And because we don't know, how do you answer that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. If we actually think about the body and soul in a holistic way, if we actually stop creating such a dichotomy between the two, as if they are just distinct ideas from each other, and we actually start seeing them as a kind of unified reality. Because if we perceive that here and now, if we actually think that my body and my soul are both things that are being saved, right? They're both connected. They're both holistic. There's a unity between the two. Then it will be easier to say to some degree that life begins at conception, because the moment that the body is the moment that the person is whole. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I just struggle with how do you then define life? Is it with the body or is it with the soul?
Oh, that's a great question. And I think that question actually has some real implication. Michael, go ahead. tell us what you're thinking. And Amy, because I think Michael's kind of going there too.
I just wanted to say, like, because Adam and Eve, they kind of like, whenever they were made, it was like their body and soul kind of came to life at the same time. So in a way, we could argue like that they're kind of almost mutually necessary. Like you can't have one without the other, really. So like technically, from that standpoint, you could say like the cells themselves are like giving birth to a soul in a way.
Yeah, I don't know if I would want to say that the cells are giving birth, but I get what you're trying to say, right? Like at any moment in which we have this, even we'll just put it cellular life, right? Like even at the point of cellular life, there is already the reality in which God is holistically creating life, right? There is no kind of separation. It does ask kind of interesting questions, Amy, when we talk about something like, what about someone who is in a vegetative state who we cannot see any kind of sign of a thought life in? Does anyone remember, this was a long time ago, but it was a huge news case for like months. There was this kind of big fight about this woman who was in this vegetative state for a very long time. And it wasn't coma, it wasn't like asleep, it was like awake, but there was no brain activity, and she was being kept alive by life support. Um, and there was the big discussion of, do we quote unquote pull the plug, or do we recognize that because her body is still functioning, she is still alive? Does anyone remember that? You may or may not, but this kind of plays into Amy's question, right? Like, if we think about it holistically, also we have to think about end of life implications. What happens when we can't see those signs of life? But I think if we take the holistic approach and we actually say that there isn't one separate from the other, that we as Christians will have a bit more robust view of life, that even in a moment of a vegetative state, we can actually say that God can still redeem. God can still fix. God can still take care of. God can still make whole once again. Does that make sense? But that only works if we actually completely take a holistic approach and we don't try to kind of pick and choose what points. That's been the problem for a lot of Christians, is that we often kind of pick and choose. We might pick and choose the soul over the body even. How many of you, would say, that of a church that like cares so much for the soul of people, but never thinks about their body? Meaning, we just care a lot to get them saved, but we don't care so much if they can't pay their electric bill. Does that make sense to everybody? Any thoughts on that? Any concerns, worries, ideas on why the church might care more about the soul than the body? Adelina, go ahead and why don't you kind of say what you're thinking there?
I think that sometimes we, because this happened to me when I was younger, is that we tend to, walk into a church or be part of a church and only focus on someone's soul. And kind of like you said, where it's like all we care about is getting that person saved. And I think that with that, and it's like in my head, but it's kind of hard getting out. But I think that being in like the church, being one with the church, we need to care more about the all around person, because you can have a great person but not the best soul, if that makes any sense. um and I think that a lot of times we just find ourselves, like you said, caring about getting that person saved, caring about, okay, like what can we do in order to get you in like better salvation? What can we do to get you saved, or deeper in your faith? But then like once that happens, we kind of just lose touch with them, because we don't really ask about like their soul anymore. Like we don't really ask just about like themselves. And
Yeah.
you can have a great soul but not like a life. And I think one of my mom's like really good friends that she was in the military with um, committed suicide a couple years ago. And they were like a Christian, they went to church all the time. But I feel like it goes a lot deeper than just um, being saved. It goes a lot deeper than just, you know, giving everything to Christ and getting deeper in your faith. Whereas like you can be a perfect, not perfect, but like you can go to church all the time, you can read the Bible all the time, you can have a great relationship with God, but you can still like be depressed inside.
Yeah.
And so that's pretty much what I was trying to say.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. Like, um, it maybe the phrase that I've heard a lot in church, or maybe from pastors that kind of sum up what you were saying there is like I've heard pastors say, "I'm in the business of getting souls into heaven." Right? Like I'm in the business of getting souls saved or getting souls into heaven, which portrays that, right? Like I'm in the business of like making your soul a good thing, but what happens to your body or what's going on in your body or what matters in your body, like we might pray for your healing, but life is life, and we'll get it really right the next time we do it, right? We'll get it better next time. But if we do take a holistic approach, we recognize that when we're in the business of people and we're in the business of building the kingdom of God, we're in the business of taking care of people's body and soul as one unified thing, right? It's why maybe one of the questions that, like for instance, when I grew up, being like, I don't know, between the ages of maybe like 14, 17, 18, um, I was depressed all the time and dealt with depression, and and I was never able to see a doctor or able to see a therapist or ever actually have any of those kind of conversations, that I probably would have benefited from, because my problem wasn't a physical problem. It was a spiritual attack that my soul just needed to be fixed from. But if the body and the soul are so intertwined, then anything that's going against my soul is going against my body. My body is going against my. Does that make sense? Like, this is why when someone says, should I take medicine? I say, yes, you should take medicine and you should pray. If you pray, you should take your medicine, right? Because when we talk about the human person, God creates us in this holistic way, not caring about one over the other, but both and. Eduardo, go ahead and ask your question here. We might end with that for today. Eduardo, are you there, man? Uh-oh, I can't see what you said.
Hello?
Oh,
Can
there
you
you
guys
go.
hear me? Okay.
Yep.
No, it's because like it was like really interesting, and like I do agree with what she said, and like it goes a lot deeper than just like getting people's souls saved, and like what you said, what you said as well, and like how we actually have to be like there for people as well, and like just because like I guess like a lot of people like do emphasize of winning souls, and that is really crucially important. But it's just like when they come to do life with people, and when they and when we are with people in the time of like their process of sanctification, I guess it's not just as emphasized as it is as like winning souls as well. And like I guess that brings in like also like where people like are growing within like their body and their own soul as well after like being saved.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think sanctification and justification are two sides of the same coin when you talk about salvation, right? You can't talk about justification without talking about sanctification, and you can't talking about sanctification without talking about justification. And I think you're right, Eduardo. Like when we think about this idea of kind of salvation, we're also thinking about this like this process that people are going through, a process that sometimes we can kind of pair to this word healing, that we're in the process of being redeemed. And this is why Paul in the New Testament might refer to salvation as something that's happened to you, that's happening, that happened to you in the past, that is currently happening to you, and that is happening to you as we progress into the future. It's not a one-time event. It's not your soul is saved and you're good to go. It is you have been saved, you are in the process of being saved, and eventually we will be saved fully. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
And I think that when we kind of take that approach to it, we end up being a bit healthier as people. And we be healthier as pastors and helping people process their salvation rather than just saying, I got you saved. I got you to raise your hand. I'm on to the next one. Wonderful. Okay, we have a few other things to talk about from this chapter that we're going to kind of jump on Thursday. Let me know. And Adelina. Yes, I'm with you, Adelina. Great, thank you. Hey, let me know if you would just do me a favor, because it's going to help me and it'll help us in this process. Let me know what you liked, what you struggled with in terms of, I know it's an early class, and then also we're not with each other and we're all on a computer, like it makes it even harder. Let me know if you have some thoughts or ideas and ways that we can kind of process this time that we have better together. If you're like, hey, why don't we try doing something like this? Shoot me an email. I'm happy for any of your kind of ideas. Let's kind of try to make this the best that we can for us as a group. Does that make sense? Do me a favor, as you kind of leave, again, just type your name into the discussion, and we'll come back together on Thursday into chapter 12, and we'll go from there. So, yeah, I'll see you on Thursday. Stay safe. Wash your hands. Don't touch your face. I've been doing that a lot, and I shouldn't. So, I'll see you guys Thursday.